Archaeologists found something buried beneath the sea floor. Something that shouldn't exist according to modern science. And what it reveals about the world 4,700 years ago will change everything you thought you knew about human history. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as myth, a story, a legend passed down by ancient peoples who didn't understand the world around them. But what if they weren't making it up? What if they were describing something real, something catastrophic, something that nearly erased humanity from existence? This is that story. In the beginning, there was perfection. Not the kind you read about in fairy tales. Real perfection. A world untouched by pain, by war, by the weight of human choice. The mountains rose like cathedrals carved by an invisible hand. The seas moved in rhythm with something ancient and alive. And the sky held a blue so deep it seemed to contain all of creation itself. This was a world where men and God walked together. Where trust was not a choice but a reality. Adam looked at Eve, and in her eyes he saw the same wonder he felt in his own heart. Everything had been given to them. Not earned. Not fought for. Simply given. But then something shifted in the shadows. A whisper. Soft. Almost kind. It crept into the garden like smoke finding its way through a closed door. And with that whisper came a question that would change everything. One choice. That's all it took. Eve reached for the fruit. Adam followed. And in that moment, something invisible broke. The connection between heaven and earth fractured like glass dropped on stone. The garden that had been their home became a place they could no longer enter. A sword of fire stood at the gate, turning in every direction, making it clear, paradise was closed. The weight of that choice didn't end with them. When Eve gave birth to Cain, pain entered the world with him. Not just the pain of childbirth, but something deeper. A knowing. A heaviness that this child would inherit a broken world. That his children would inherit it too. And theirs after them. Mini cliffhanger, music becomes unsettling. But what came next would be far worse than anyone could have imagined. Because as generations passed, something else began to happen. Humanity didn't just struggle with the weight of sin. They started to forget why they were struggling at all. They built cities. They created art. They developed power. And in their power, they forgot the one thing that mattered, that they were not gods themselves. Music reaches a tense plateau. And that's when the Watchers came down from the sky. 200 of them. Beings so beautiful, so radiant, that when they descended on Mount Hermon, humanity didn't see angels. They saw gods. Salvation. Power made flesh. But they didn't come to save anyone. They came with a purpose that would corrupt everything they touched. They would teach humanity secrets that should have remained hidden. They would produce children, giants, who would rule the earth with an iron fist and an appetite for blood that never ceased. And God watched it all happen. And then, finally, he had enough. This is the story of the last warning humanity ever received. The story of one man who heard God speak in a world that had stopped listening. A man who spent decades building something nobody believed in. A man named Noah. And what he witnessed when the sky finally opened will explain why ancient flood stories appear in nearly every culture on Earth. Why civilizations that had no contact with each other all describe the same catastrophic event. Because it wasn't a legend. It was a judgment. The world was burning. Not with fire. Not yet. But with something far more destructive, the slow, creeping decay of the human soul. Generations had passed since Adam and Eve walked out of the garden. Centuries. Millennia. And with each passing year, humanity moved further from what they were meant to be. The first cities rose on fertile plains. Tribes became nations. Men learned to shape stone into towers and metal into weapons. They built temples and altars, not to honor the God they had forgotten, but to worship themselves. Their own power. Their own strength. In the valleys and on the hillsides, people gathered in crowds. They danced around fires. They sang songs praising gods of their own making, idols of gold and stone that could not see, could not hear, could not save them. The true God, the one who had walked with Adam in the cool of the day, was now just a whisper, a legend. A story parents told children that nobody really believed anymore. But not everyone had forgotten. There were still those who remembered. A small remnant. They kept the faith alive in their hearts, passing it down like an ember that refused to die. Among them was a man named Enoch. He walked with God in a way that made others wonder what he knew that they did not. His eyes seemed to see beyond the veil of the world. His dreams were prophetic. His warnings were ignored. Then one day, Enoch disappeared. People said God had taken him, that he was snatched away before the corruption consumed all of creation. And his absence felt like the last light going out in the darkness. Because what came next would be the deepest corruption the world had ever known. It started on Mount Hermon. 200 celestial beings gathered in that sacred place. Not ordinary angels. These were watchers, being sent from heaven to observe humanity, to guard creation, to maintain the boundary between the divine and the earthly. But something had changed in them. Or perhaps they had always harbored this desire, waiting for the moment when they would finally act on it. They looked down at the earth, at the cities, at the women, and they made a covenant. A pact sworn in heaven that would shake the foundations of creation itself. They swore that they would descend to earth and take human wives. They swore that they would teach humanity forbidden knowledge. They swore that they would never return to heaven until they had fulfilled their purpose. And then they fell. The descent was not like rain falling. It was like the sky opening and pouring out glory. When they arrived, the earth trembled. The air itself seemed to shimmer with their presence. Men saw them and called them gods. Women saw them and forgot their own names. They were beautiful in a way that human beauty could never be. Their clothes shone like starlight captured and woven into fabric. Their voices carried the weight of eternity. When they walked, the ground seemed to acknowledge their importance. When they spoke, the world listened. Humanity did not resist. How could they? These beings offered power. They offered knowledge. They offered immortality, or at least the promise of it. And in a world that had already turned away from God, in a world that had learned to worship anything and everything except the one true God, why would they say no? The women came to them willingly. Some out of desire. Some out of fear. Some out of the simple human longing to be close to something greater than themselves. And the Watchers took them, married them, produced children with them. And those children were not human. They were giants. The Nephilim. Beings who inherited the strength of angels and the cunning of humans. They grew to immense heights. Their bodies were twisted with power. Their eyes burned with an intelligence that was not quite human and not quite divine. They were the first renowned men, heroes whose names were sung and whose deeds were feared. But they were not good. The Nephilim ruled the cities with an iron fist. They enslaved humanity. They demanded tributes of blood. They hunted men and women for sport. And when they ran out of livestock and livestock to eat, they turned on humanity itself. The fertile plains that had once grown crops became camps of slavery. The rivers ran not with water but with the tears of the oppressed. And the Watchers who had fathered them, they did not stop it. They encouraged it. One of the Watchers, a being named Azazel, began to teach humanity the secrets of war. He showed men how to forge swords and shields and armor. He taught them the art of killing, the craft of destruction. And what had once been knowledge meant to guard creation became a tool for conquest and domination. Other Watchers taught other dark arts. One named Semyaza revealed the secrets of words and the hidden arts, sorcery, witchcraft, enchantments. Another called Barakel showed humanity the paths of the stars and taught women the power of enchantments and seduction. Kokobel, the luminous one, taught how to read the stars and control the weather itself. Knowledge that should have remained in heaven spread across the earth like a plague. Humans learned to manipulate the elements. They learned to summon spirits. They learned to alter their own bodies and the bodies of animals in ways that violated the natural order. Hybrids were born, abominations that belonged to no natural category. Half human, half beast. Twisted creatures with the strength of demons and the hunger of wild animals. The world began to change. The forests withered. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the giants who walked across it. The stars seemed less bright, as if the heavens themselves were turning away in shame. The rivers changed their courses. Nature groaned under the weight of the corruption that had been introduced. The cities that men had built became temples to the Watchers. Statues were erected in their honor, massive stone figures with wings and faces that seemed to stare into the soul of anyone who gazed upon them. Altars were constructed not to God but to idols of power and wealth and glory. People offered their children in rituals, believing that the blood of the innocent would bring them protection and blessing from the false gods they now worshipped. And the Watchers accepted these offerings. They became drunk on worship. They became addicted to the power they wielded over humanity. They married more women. They produced more giants. They taught more forbidden knowledge. Each day brought deeper corruption. Each day brought humanity further from the light. But the heavens were not silent. God watched. He saw everything. He saw the corruption spreading like poison through every level of creation. He saw the innocents being slaughtered. He saw the Watchers breaking their divine boundaries. He saw humanity, created in His image, being enslaved and degraded and transformed into something less than human. And His patience, which had been immeasurable, began to come to an end. In the highest heavens, in the throne room of the Most High, a decision was made. The time for mercy was running out. The time for judgment was approaching. The archangels were summoned. Michael, the prince of the heavenly host, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, and countless legions of angels whose names are known only to God Himself. They were given their orders. The Watchers would be bound and imprisoned in eternal darkness. The giants would be destroyed. The corruption would be cleansed from the earth. And humanity would be given one last chance, one final warning before judgment fell. But first, God needed a messenger. He needed someone who would hear His voice. Someone who would obey even when the entire world mocked Him. Someone who would build something impossible and preach a message that nobody wanted to hear. He needed Noah. And the clock was ticking. In a world of chaos and darkness, there was one man who walked differently. His name was Noah. He was not famous. He was not powerful. He did not command armies or rule cities or sit on thrones. He was a farmer, a builder, a man with calloused hands and a quiet spirit. While the world around him descended into madness, Noah worked the land with patience and purpose. He lived in a time when the giants roamed freely, when the watchers were worshipped as gods, when human sacrifice was common, when the strong preyed on the weak and nobody questioned it because there was no one strong enough to stop it. Kings bowed to the Nephilim. Priests served false idols. Magicians summoned demons and called them divine. And Noah lived among them, untouched by their corruption. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, grew up learning from their father a different way. While other children were taught to worship the giants, Noah's sons were taught to fear the Lord. While other families built shrines to the watchers, Noah's family prayed to the God of creation. While the world became increasingly violent and dark, Noah's household became increasingly devoted to truth. People mocked him for it. They called him old-fashioned, a dreamer, a man trapped in myths that nobody believed anymore. They whispered that he was weak because he did not seek power, that he was foolish because he did not worship the gods of the age, that he was wasting his life on invisible things and forgotten stories. But Noah did not care what they said, because he heard something they could not hear. He felt something they could not feel. He knew something they could not know. When he walked through the fields, he felt the presence of the Almighty like a gentle breeze moving through the leaves. When he stood in the garden, he heard the voice of God speaking to him in the silence between moments. When he looked at creation, he saw not just the physical world but the hand of the Creator moving through it. This was not faith born of desperation. This was not belief clinging to hope because there was nothing else to hold on to. This was something deeper, something real. Noah did not believe in God the way other men believed in the myths of their gods. Noah knew God. He walked with him. He talked with him. He listened for his voice the way a man listens for the voice of his closest friend. And then one night, everything changed. The darkness had fallen thick across the land. The stars were hidden behind clouds that seemed to press down on the earth with an almost physical weight. Noah was alone, walking through the fields near his home, when the air itself seemed to shimmer. The darkness parted like a veil being drawn back, and light poured in. Not ordinary light. Light that carried intelligence. Light that had a presence. And then he heard it. The voice was not loud. It did not thunder like storm or shake the ground beneath his feet. It was quieter than a whisper, yet more powerful than any sound he had ever heard. It moved not through his ears but directly into his spirit, filling him with understanding and knowledge and purpose. The Most High spoke to him. Noah fell to his knees. His entire body trembled. He was being addressed by the Creator himself, the God who had formed the mountains, who had named the stars, who had breathed life into creation at the very beginning of time. And this God was speaking to him, to Noah, a simple man, a farmer, a man with no power, no influence, no importance in the eyes of the world. The message was clear. The end of all flesh has come before me. The earth is filled with violence. The corruption has spread to the very roots of creation. The watchers have broken their boundaries. The giants have devoured the innocent. Humanity has turned away from truth and embraced lies and bloodshed and darkness. I will bring judgment upon the earth, but I am offering you a covenant, a way of salvation. You alone have found favor in my eyes. You and your household will be saved. You must build an ark, a vessel of cypress wood, 3 stories high, large enough to hold your family and representatives of every living creature upon the earth. And when the judgment comes, you will enter the ark, and the rest will be washed away. Noah did not question. He did not ask for clarification or more time to think about it. In that moment, with the presence of God filling his entire being, he understood what he had to do. He understood that this was not a metaphor or a test. This was a real command from a real God about a real judgment that was coming. He stood, tears streaming down his face, and he said only one thing: I will obey. The next morning, as the sun rose over a world that had no idea what was coming, Noah gathered his family, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. They stood together, and he told them what God had commanded. He told them about the ark, about the judgment, about the flood that would come and wash away the corruption. Most men would have laughed. Most wives would have tried to convince their husbands that they had gone mad. Most sons would have refused to participate in such a bizarre and impossible project. But Noah's family had learned to trust. They had been taught, through years of living with Noah, that the invisible God was more real than the visible world. That faith was not foolishness but wisdom. Shem was the first to speak. He looked at his father, and his voice was steady and calm. If the Lord has spoken, then we will obey. And so the work began. Noah moved to a place where he could build. He gathered materials. Cypress wood, strong and resistant to rot. Tools. Supplies. Everything he would need to construct a vessel that had never been built before. Because nobody had ever built an ark. Nobody had ever needed to. There had never been rain before. The world had never known a flood. But Noah was being called to build for something the world had never experienced. The work was hard, physical, exhausting. Every single day, Noah and his sons worked under the sun. They cut timber. They shaped logs. They drove stakes into the ground and raised walls. The sound of axes and hammers echoed through the valleys. It became a familiar sound, a constant reminder to everyone in the surrounding area that something strange was happening. And people came to watch. They gathered. They laughed. They mocked. "Look at the madman," they said. "Who builds a ship where there is no sea? What flood is he expecting? The sky has never opened. The heavens have never poured down water. He is wasting his life on the delusions of an old man." They called him a fool. They spread rumors about his mental state. They whispered to his sons, trying to convince them to abandon this ridiculous project. They offered them money and power and position if they would just stop and return to normal life. But Noah did not respond to the mockery. He did not defend himself or argue with his critics. He simply continued to work. Every hammer blow was a prayer. Every beam that was raised was an act of faith. Every nail that was driven was a declaration that he believed God more than he believed the doubts of the world. Years passed. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. The ark grew. It became impossible to ignore. It rose above the landscape like a wooden mountain, 3 stories high. Massive compartments. Space for the animals that God would send. Space for food and water and everything that would be needed to survive the judgment. And still, Noah preached. He walked through the cities. He stood in the streets. He called out to people to repent, to turn away from the worship of false gods, to abandon the teachings of the watchers, to return to the God of creation before it was too late. "Repent," he said. "There is still time. The Most High is patient, but his patience has limits. Turn from your violence. Turn from your idolatry. Turn from your worship of demons and giants and false gods. Return to the Creator before the door of salvation closes forever." But the world did not listen. Instead, the feasts increased. The orgies multiplied. The worship of the Nephilim became even more intense. The sacrifices of children on the altars of false gods became more frequent. The knowledge taught by the watchers spread further. Sorcery and witchcraft and enchantments became commonplace. Violence escalated. The strong became stronger. The weak became weaker. And nobody stopped to consider that perhaps this old man building in the wilderness was trying to warn them about something real. But there were signs. If people had been paying attention, they would have noticed. The moon began to change color. There were nights when it hung in the sky like a disk of congealed blood. The animals began to behave strangely. Predators and prey walked together without conflict. Birds abandoned their nests and flew in patterns that seemed intentional, as if they were fleeing something invisible. The ground trembled. Not violently, but persistently. A constant reminder that something beneath the surface was shifting. The wind began to blow in ways that defied nature. It would come from the east and the west simultaneously, as if creation itself was being pulled in opposite directions. It carried strange odors. Scents of things burning. Scents of things rotting. Scents that made people uneasy without understanding why. Light rain began to fall in places where rain had never fallen before. In the deserts. In the dry places. In the lands where the sun had always reigned unchallenged. And the old people, those who remembered the oldest stories, whispered to each other that these were signs. Omens. The earth was being prepared for something. But the human heart is capable of denying even what it sees with its own eyes. Even in the face of these wonders and terrors, people did not repent. They did not turn back to God. They did not flee to the ark and beg Noah to save them. Instead, they hardened their hearts. They decided that these signs meant nothing. They chose to believe that the world would continue as it always had. They laughed at Noah even louder. And then the 7th day came. The ark was finished. It stood complete, perfect, exactly as God had specified. Noah looked at what he had built, and he understood that he had done everything that had been asked of him. His work was complete. The judgment was about to begin. God spoke to Noah one final time. "Come, you and all your household into the ark. For I have seen in you a righteousness in this generation. Bring with you representatives of every living creature, 2 of every kind, male and female, and your household, that you may be preserved." Noah did not hesitate. He called his family together, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, and they walked toward the ark. Not with fanfare, not with celebration, but with quiet reverence. They understood that they were entering into something momentous. They were walking into salvation while the world around them walked toward judgment. As they approached the ark, something began to happen. The animals arrived. They came from every direction, not driven by handlers, not forced by men, but called by something invisible, by instinct, by the hand of the Almighty Himself. They came 2 by 2. The lions walked beside the lambs without hunger. The serpents coiled without venom. The eagles perched beside the doves. The natural order that had been broken by the corruption of the watchers was temporarily restored. The predator and the prey walked together in peace. The people who were watching could not believe what they were seeing. Some fell to their knees. Some reached out as if to join the procession. Some began to call out to Noah, "Wait, Please, let us in. We believe now. We repent. Save us. But it was too late. The door of the ark moved on its own, not pushed by human hands, but moved by the will of heaven itself. It swung slowly, solemnly, sealing the family inside. Noah stood just before the closing, and his eyes met the eyes of the people he had been trying to warn for years. And then the door shut with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. Outside, the sound of weeping began. Inside, the sound of prayer. And in the heavens, the Most High looked down and saw that everything was ready. The time had come. The patience of God had come to an end. The heavens began to move. The clouds began to gather. The waters of the deep began to churn. And the whole earth, though it did not yet know it, was about to be transformed forever. The sky did not gradually darken. It did not slowly cloud over the way normal weather approaches. Instead, it seemed to tear open all at once. The veil between heaven and earth ripped apart like cloth splitting under pressure, and what poured through was not rain. It was judgment. The first drops fell heavy and deliberate. Each one seemed to carry weight beyond water. They struck the ground with force that made people stumble backward. The dust of the earth, which had never known moisture from the sky before, absorbed these drops like a sponge drinking desperately. And then came more, and more, and more. The laughter that had echoed through the villages moments before ceased abruptly. Fear began to dawn in the eyes of those who had mocked Noah. This was not natural weather. Every instinct in the human body screamed that something catastrophic was happening. The air itself felt different, charged, heavy, alive with a power that was not of this world. The wind began to move with intention. Not the gentle breeze that had always cooled the earth. Not the storm wind that occasionally bent the trees and scattered leaves. This was something else entirely. It howled with voices that seemed almost alive. It tore through buildings as if they were made of straw. It lifted people off their feet and hurled them like broken dolls across the ground. The clouds twisted and formed into shapes that defied description. Colossal eyes of vapor and lightning. Mouths that opened and closed as if speaking ancient words. The entire sky became a canvas of fury and judgment. Lightning did not flash in the normal way. Instead, it slashed downward like spears hurled by warriors in an invisible war being fought in the heavens. And the water kept falling. Inside the ark, Noah knelt in prayer. His voice was barely audible above the roar of the storm, but it did not matter. God heard every word, every whisper of faith, every declaration of trust. Around him, his family huddled together. His wife held steady, her face showing fear but also resolve. The 3 sons and their wives stood close, their hands touching, drawing strength from each other. The animals responded to the chaos with primal terror. The lions roared. The eagles shrieked. The snakes hissed. The very air inside the ark seemed to vibrate with the fear of creatures that could sense the violence of the world outside. But something miraculous happened. As the moments passed, as the storm raged and the waters rose, the animals began to calm. Not because the danger passed, but because they sensed the presence of God within that vessel. They understood, on some level beyond human comprehension, that they were protected, that the hand of the Almighty was upon this place. Outside, there was no such sanctuary. The waters rose with relentless speed. What had been solid ground became an abyss. The rivers that had flowed peacefully for thousands of years began to overflow, their banks bursting as if they could no longer contain the force of water being poured from heaven. The valleys that had been gathering places for villages and towns became channels of destruction. The water did not simply cover the earth, it consumed it. Families desperately climbed to higher ground. Fathers carried children on their shoulders, wading through water that grew deeper with each passing moment. Mothers screamed their children's names, trying to keep their families together as the current grew stronger. The elderly moved slower, knowing somehow that they would not survive what was coming, but still trying, still pushing forward, still refusing to accept that this was the end. But it was the end. For them. The 1,000-year-old trees that had stood since before the corruption of the Watchers now fell like fragile branches before the force of the deluge. Their massive trunks snapped. Their roots were torn from the earth. They were carried away as easily as twigs floating on a stream. Mountains, once proud monuments to creation, began to disappear beneath the veil of water. The highest peaks of the world, Ararat and others whose names are no longer remembered, slowly sank beneath waves that seemed to have no limit. The towers that had been erected in homage to the Nephilim crumbled like sand before wind. The temples where human blood had been sacrificed, where children had been offered to false gods, where the knowledge of the Watchers had been preserved and taught, all of it was swept away. The statues of the giants, carved in their image to perpetuate their memory and their power, toppled and were buried beneath mountains of water and mud and the detritus of a civilization being erased. The cities vanished. Not gradually, not over time, but completely and within hours. Entire centers of human civilization, the centers of human achievement and human depravity, were wiped from the face of the earth as if they had never existed at all. The streets where people had walked and lived and dreamed and sinned were now channels for rushing water. The homes where families had slept were now tombs. The markets where people had bought and sold and traded were now burial grounds. The screams of men, women, and children mingled with the roar of the flood and the thunder from the heavens. A symphony of despair, of final moments, of regret and terror, and the desperate knowledge that there was nowhere left to run, that the warning they had rejected, the message they had mocked, the old man they had called a fool, had been telling the truth, and it was too late to do anything about it. Some of the giants, the Nephilim who had ruled the earth with such terrible power, tried to resist. Their immense strength, which had allowed them to dominate humanity, was useless against the force of God's judgment. One giant, consumed by the madness of pride even in the face of his own death, climbed to the highest point of land still visible above the water. He raised his massive fists toward the sky, and his voice, which had always been obeyed, now thundered a final defiance. We are eternal. We are immortal. We are the children of heaven. We cannot be destroyed. And in the instant after he spoke those words, a liquid wall of water, towering above even his immense height, descended upon him. It swallowed him whole. It silenced his voice. It ended his existence. And it proved, in the most final way possible, that nothing created is eternal except the Creator himself. The altars of the watchers were ripped from the ground and carried away into the depths. The sacrificial stones, stained with the blood of the innocent, were buried beneath the flood, their guilt washed away but the weight of it hanging heavy in the heavens. The profane inscriptions that had been carved to preserve the knowledge of the fallen angels were erased, as if God himself was rewriting the history of the world, removing the record of the corruption that had infected creation. All the knowledge that the Watchers had taught humanity, all the sorcery and witchcraft and enchantments, all the secrets of war and manipulation and control, all of it sank beneath the waves. The books that had been written, the tablets that had been carved, the traditions that had been passed down, all erased, all gone, as if they had never existed at all. The entire earth seemed to weep as it was washed with the tears and rage of divine judgment. The waters continued to rise for 40 days and 40 nights. Not continuously in the way people might imagine rain falling, but relentlessly, constantly, without pause or mercy. The heavens poured out their fury, and the earth received it, and there was no escape, no shelter, no place of safety except for one wooden vessel that floated upon the chaos, sustained by a strength that was not human. With each passing day, the reality of what was happening became clearer. This was not a temporary storm that would pass. This was not a flood that would recede. This was not a judgment that would relent. This was the end of the world, the end of an age, the end of a civilization and all the corruption it had contained. Noah's family, sheltering inside the ark, experienced the horror through sound and movement and the trembling of the vessel itself. The ark swayed and rocked on waves that had become mountains of water. Timbers creaked under the stress of forces that pressed against them from every direction. The sound was deafening. Thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Wind that shrieked like the voices of the damned. Water that rushed and roared like a living thing with hunger that could never be satisfied. But the ark held. Not through the strength of the wood, though Noah had chosen the finest cypress available. Not through the skill of the builder, though Noah had worked with perfect precision. But through the hand of God that was upon it. The Most High himself sustained that vessel. He held it together. He guided it through the chaos. He preserved it and all that was within it. Inside, Shem looked at his father. The younger man's face was pale with fear, but his eyes held steady. He spoke over the roar of the storm, his voice barely audible. "Father, God has kept his word." And Noah, his weathered face streaked with tears, pulled his son close. His voice, when he spoke, carried both the grief of witnessing judgment and the peace that came from absolute trust. "Yes, but my heart aches for them. For all those we tried to warn. For all those who chose not to listen." Outside, there was no more warning. No more chance to repent. No more opportunity for salvation. The time of mercy had passed. The door of the ark was sealed. And the judgment of God fell upon the world without restraint or limitation. For 40 days and 40 nights, the deluge continued. Each dawn was darker than the last. The clouds grew thicker. The water rose higher. The roar of the flood never ceased. Lightning continued to slash across the sky like swords in an invisible war. The wind never diminished. The rain never lightened. It was as if all of creation was being unmade. As if the world was being returned to the chaos that had existed before God spoke creation into being. And still, the ark floated. It rose above the highest mountains. Ararat, sea, Everest, all the peaks of the world that men had thought were the closest points to heaven, all were swallowed beneath the waters. The highest point of human habitation, the deepest refuge of those who sought higher ground, all were covered by depths that seemed to have no bottom. The Watchers, those celestial beings who had rebelled and corrupted creation, were now bound. They were sealed in the darkness beneath the earth, imprisoned in caverns of stone and shadow, chained by the hand of Michael and the hosts of heaven. They would await the day of final judgment, locked away from creation, unable to see the light of the world they had defiled. Their punishment had begun, and it would never end. The women who had borne the giants, who had been accomplices in the corruption of creation, were transformed. Their beauty, which had made them desirable to the angels, turned to something else entirely. Their faces lost their radiance. Their voices became wails. Their tears fed the waters of the abyss. They became something neither human nor divine. Trapped between worlds, cursed to echo eternally over the waves, their voices luring men to the same fate of perdition they had once chosen. The mermaids of ancient legend, the sirens who would haunt human memory for thousands of years to come, were born from this divine punishment. Symbols of temptation and judgment. Reminders that even the most beautiful things can become corrupted by rebellion against God. Inside the ark, the days were beyond measure. Time seemed to move strangely. It was as if the normal flow of hours and days had been suspended. The animals, which should have needed constant feeding and care, seemed to require less. The food that had been stored seemed to sustain longer than it should have. The air, though stale and heavy, remained breathable. Everything pointed to the fact that this was not a natural disaster being endured through human strength, but a supernatural preservation happening through divine will. Noah spent his time in prayer. His sons worked to care for the animals. His wife and their wives maintained what order they could in the chaos. And together, the 8 of them, the only humans alive on a drowned world, held on to faith. Because outside, there was only death. The corpses of millions floated on the surface of the waters. The bodies of the drowned rose and fell with the waves. The eyes of the dead stared sightless toward a sky they could no longer see. The voices of the dead, thousands of them, seemed to cry out from the depths. Some of those voices belonged to people who had rejected Noah's warning. Others belonged to the innocent children who had been sacrificed on altars. Others belonged to the slaves who had lived under the tyranny of the giants. All of them were now equal in death. All of them were now equal in the judgment of God. The smell was beyond what human lungs should endure, but those in the ark were protected from it. The sight was beyond what human eye should witness, but those in the ark were shielded from it. The sound was beyond what human ear should bear, but those in the ark were insulated from the worst of it. God was not only preserving them physically, He was preserving them spiritually and emotionally from the full horror of what was happening outside. Still, they knew. They could not help but know, even in their protected state, that the world was being destroyed. That judgment was being fulfilled. That the warning they had preached had come to pass, and no one outside had believed. The water continued to rise. The waves grew taller. The storm never abated. And the ark, tossed upon the chaos, held firm. And then, gradually, something changed. It was not sudden. It was not the reversal of a switch. But like a wave that reaches its peak and begins, almost imperceptibly, to recede, the fury of the storm began to lose its violence. The rain, which had fallen with such relentless force, began to lighten. The thunder, which had shaken the very foundations of creation, began to grow more distant. The lightning, which had slashed across the sky with such terrible power, began to come less frequently. The wind, which had howled like a beast in agony, began to diminish. Inside the ark, Noah felt the change before he understood it. The constant rocking that had become the rhythm of existence, the swaying that had defined every moment for so long, began to slow. The creaking of the timbers, which had been a constant reminder of stress and strain, began to ease. The roar of chaos that had filled every space, that had invaded every thought, began to fade. Noah stood. His legs, which had grown weak from weeks of confinement and prayer, trembled beneath him. He moved to where he could see through the small window that had been built into the side of the ark. And what he saw made him pause. The rain was still falling, but it was gentle now. Not the violent assault of judgment, but the normal rain that the world had never known before. The kind that nourishes the earth. The kind that brings life rather than death. And the sky, though still dark with clouds, was no longer tearing itself open. It was beginning to part. Slowly, gradually. As if the heavens themselves were catching their breath. He called his family to him. They came, moving slowly, their bodies stiff from confinement. They looked out together at the changing world. And though none of them spoke, they all understood. The judgment was ending. The flood was beginning to recede. The waters, which had risen above the highest mountains, began to subside. Not quickly, but persistently. Day by day, the level of the water dropped. The peaks of mountains began to emerge from the depths like ancient sentinels rising from sleep. First the highest, then gradually the lower ones. Land began to appear where there had been only water for so long. Weeks passed. Then months. The ark, which had been tossed upon the chaos, began to settle. It descended through the waters as they receded beneath it. It came to rest, finally, upon the slopes of Mount Ararat, the highest mountain in that region of the world. The vessel that had been the only home Noah and his family had known for so long came to stillness, came to rest, came to peace. Inside the ark, there was a moment of absolute silence. Not the silence that comes from the absence of sound, but the silence that comes from the cessation of chaos. The silence after a storm has passed. The silence of exhaustion and relief, and the knowledge that one has survived something that should have killed them. Noah knelt. His family knelt with him. And in that silence, the sound of gratitude rose from their hearts. Not words. Words were insufficient. But the deep, soul-level gratitude of those who had been preserved. Of those who had been chosen. Of those who had been saved when the entire world perished. Then God spoke. The voice was gentle. Not the thunder that had announced judgment. But the quiet voice of a father speaking to his children. Of a God speaking to those he loved. Come out of the ark. You and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out with you every living creature that is with you. Let them go free upon the earth. Let them multiply and fill the earth as they did before. Noah understood what he was being commanded to do. This was not just an instruction. This was the beginning of a new world. This was the moment when the old was left behind and the new was being born. He moved to the door of the ark. The same door that God had sealed when they entered, preserving them through the judgment. Noah reached out and touched it. And the door, responding to the will of the Almighty, began to move. It swung open slowly, solemnly, like a sanctuary being opened for the first time. Light poured in. Real sunlight. The warmth of the sun on skin that had not felt it for so long. The smell of air that was not stale and confined. The wind, gentle now, carrying scents of earth and growth and possibility. Noah stood in the opening and looked out upon a world transformed. The earth, though wounded, was healing. The water had receded enough to reveal land, though not all the land. The highest elevations showed bare rock and mud, the detritus of the flood. But even there, even on those scarred surfaces, there was the promise of renewal. And on the slopes lower down, where the water had receded further, green was already beginning to appear. Shoots of vegetation pushing through the mud. Life asserting itself once again. The animals began to emerge. They came out slowly, cautiously, as if they too were uncertain about this new world. The lions came first, their majestic forms moving with careful steps. Behind them came the deer and the antelope. The birds flew out, their wings catching the sunlight as they soared into the sky for the first time in months. The snakes slithered down the slopes. The insects emerged. Every living creature that God had preserved came forth and began to fill the earth once more. Shem stood beside his father and watched them go. His voice, when he spoke, carried wonder. Father, it is as if the earth is being born again. And Noah, his eyes fixed on the horizon, spoke softly. It is. God has not destroyed creation. He has cleansed it. He has washed away the corruption. He has given the earth a second chance. And with it, he has given us the responsibility to steward it better than the generation that came before. The sun set over the new world that evening. The first sunset Noah had witnessed since entering the ark. The sky was painted in colors that seemed to contain all the beauty that creation possessed. Reds and oranges and purples and gold. It was a sight so breathtaking that Noah's family stood together in silence, unable to speak. And then Noah made a decision. He gathered stones. Large stones. He found a place on the slope of Mount Ararat where he could construct an altar. An altar not to any false god. Not to any of the idols that had caused the corruption. But to the God of creation. The God who judges. The God who saves. With his son's help, Noah built the altar. He worked with the same care and precision that he had used to build the ark. This was sacred work. This was the moment when humanity would begin its relationship with God anew. When the altar was complete, Noah selected from among the clean animals, those animals that God had designated as acceptable for sacrifice. He chose the finest, the best, the most perfect, and with reverence and gratitude, he offered them to the Lord. The flames rose from the altar. The smoke ascended into the heavens. It carried with it the scent of worship and gratitude and the commitment of a man and his family to honor the God who had saved them. And in that moment, something shifted in the heavens. God smelled the aroma of the sacrifice. And the Most High, who had just finished judging the world, now turned his attention to grace, to mercy, to the covenant that would define the relationship between God and humanity for all the generations that would come after. And God spoke. Never again will I destroy all flesh because of the wickedness of mankind. Never again will I bring judgment of this magnitude upon creation. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, but I will show mercy. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. And then a sign appeared in the heavens. It emerged from the clouds like a bridge between earth and sky. An arc of colors so beautiful, so perfect, that it seemed to contain the very essence of promise itself. Red and orange and yellow and green and blue and violet. A rainbow. A symbol that would endure for all time. A reminder that though God judges evil, his mercy is greater. That though his wrath is terrible, his love is eternal. Noah stood and gazed upon it, and tears streamed down his face. His family stood beside him, and they too wept. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of profound gratitude, of awe, of the knowledge that they were living in the moment when God sealed a new covenant with humanity. The rainbow faded as the sun completed its descent. but its image remained burned into the minds of Noah and his family. A promise, a sign, a reminder that would sustain them through all the days of their lives. That night, Noah's family slept in the open air for the first time in months. They slept on the earth that had been cleansed, under stars that shone without the interference of the clouds that had covered the sky during the flood, and they slept the sleep of the righteous, the sleep of those who had endured and survived. The days that followed became the foundation of a new world. Noah and his family descended from Mount Ararat. They found places where the water had receded and the earth was becoming fertile once more. They built shelters, they planted seeds, they worked the land with their hands, and gradually, the world that had been drowned began to show signs of recovery. The animals, which had been released from the ark, spread across the earth. They multiplied and filled the land as God had commanded. Some remained relatively close to where they had been released. Others migrated to distant corners of the world, following instincts that had been encoded into them before creation itself. And the descendants of Noah began to spread across the earth as well. Shem and his family moved to the east. They became the ancestors of the peoples who would inhabit that region. They carried with them the memory of what had happened, the knowledge of the flood, the understanding of God's judgment and God's mercy. These stories would be passed down through generations. They would be told around fires. They would be preserved in memory. And thousands of years later, they would still be remembered, passed down through cultures and civilizations that had no direct connection to Noah but whose ancestors had heard the story and preserved it. Ham and his family moved in a different direction. They became the ancestors of the peoples who would inhabit the lands of Africa and parts of Asia and the Middle East. They too carried the memory. They too would pass down the story. Japheth and his family moved north and west. They became the ancestors of the peoples who would inhabit Europe and parts of Asia. And in each of these branches of humanity, the knowledge of the flood was preserved. Years passed. Noah lived a long life after the flood. He watched his sons establish their families. He watched his grandchildren grow and have children of their own. He saw the earth truly coming back to life, the forests growing, the rivers flowing again in their courses, the animals thriving and multiplying. But Noah never forgot what he had witnessed. He carried the weight of it, the knowledge that the world had been judged, that the corruption had been so complete, so thorough, that the only solution was to wash it away, that the watchers had rebelled and been imprisoned, that the giants had been destroyed, that humanity had been given a second chance, preserved in the form of one righteous man and his family. And he knew something else. Something that he did not speak of often, but which he carried in his heart. The knowledge that the human heart had not fundamentally changed. That the tendency toward evil, though present in him as well, had been inherited by his sons and would be inherited by their descendants. That the battle between good and evil, between obedience and rebellion, between faith and doubt, would continue. But God had made a promise. Never again would creation be destroyed in this way. Never again would judgment be so complete. There would be justice. There would be consequences for sin. But there would also be patience. There would be opportunity for repentance. There would be the possibility of redemption. Because mercy had triumphed over judgment. Because grace had been offered. Because God, in his infinite wisdom and love, had decided that humanity deserved another chance. Not because they had earned it. Not because they deserved it. But because God's love was greater than human depravity. The old world, the world of giants and watchers and forbidden knowledge and complete corruption, was gone. Buried beneath the waters. Erased from the earth. Preserved only in the memory of those who had survived and the God who had seen it all. The new world, the world that would be built by Noah's descendants, would face its own struggles, its own temptations, its own moral challenges, but it would also have the memory of the flood, the knowledge that God could judge, but also the knowledge that God could save. Noah stood one morning, years after the flood, on the slopes of the land that had become his home. The earth was green around him. The animals moved freely. Birds sang. Rivers flowed. Life had returned to abundance. And he looked up to the sky, clear and bright, and he thanked God for the covenant, for the promise, for the opportunity to live in a world that had been cleansed and renewed. But he also understood that this world, this new beginning, was not the end of the story. It was simply a chapter, a moment when God had paused to judge and cleanse and renew. But the larger story was still unfolding. The battle between good and evil would continue. God's plan for humanity would unfold over centuries and millennia. And in that plan, there would be more judgment. But there would also be more grace, more mercy, more opportunities for redemption. The flood had not solved the problem of human sin, but it had reset the clock. It had given creation a fresh start. It had demonstrated the power and the justice and the mercy of God in a way that no other event could have done, and the memory of it would endure. Thousands of years later, when civilizations had risen and fallen, when the knowledge of the flood had been preserved in stories and myths and ancient texts, people would still remember. In every corner of the world where humans had spread, there would be stories of a great flood. Stories of a man who built a boat. Stories of judgment and salvation. Stories of how God had cleansed the earth and made a covenant to preserve it, because the flood was real. It had happened, and its impact would echo through human history forever. The story of the flood did not die with Noah. It could not. The weight of it was too great. The reality of it was too profound. Those who had been saved, who had walked out of the ark onto a world that had been washed clean, carried the memory with them like a sacred burden. They understood that they had been chosen, that they had been preserved for a reason, and that reason was to bear witness, to remember, to pass down to their children and their grandchildren the knowledge of what God had done. Shem sat with his sons around the fire. The night was clear. The stars shone with a brilliance that only those who had lived through the flood could truly appreciate, because they understood that those stars had been hidden for so long, that the light had been blocked by the clouds of judgment. And now, seeing them again, they recognized them as a gift. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, Shem said. This story is not just history. It is not just something that happened in the past. It is a truth that must be preserved, because your children will ask you, and their children will ask them. And generations from now, people will want to know what happened in those days. They will want to understand how the world was judged and cleansed. And Shem began to tell the story. He told it in detail. The corruption that had spread, the watchers who had descended, the giants who had ruled with tyranny, the warning that Noah had preached for so many years, the mocking of those who refused to listen, the construction of the ark, the sealing of the door, the rain that fell from heaven, the waters that rose and covered the earth, the 40 days and 40 nights of judgment, the preservation within the ark, the landing on Mount Ararat, the covenant and the rainbow. He told it with such vividness, such emotion, such detailed accuracy, that those who heard it felt as if they were witnessing it themselves, as if they could see the waters rising, could hear the thunder, could feel the fear and the faith and the hope that had sustained Noah and his family through those long months. And when Shem finished, his sons looked at each other with an understanding that something sacred had just been transmitted, something that had to be preserved, something that could not be allowed to fade into the mists of time. Shem's eldest son leaned forward. His voice was serious, weighted with the responsibility of what he had just heard. Father, I will tell this story to my children, and they will tell it to theirs. We will keep it alive as long as there are descendants of Noah to tell it. And so the oral tradition began. The story spread, not through writing at first. Writing would come later, developed as civilizations grew and organized themselves. But through the spoken word, through the transmission of memory from generation to generation, around fires, in homes, in gatherings, in the quiet moments when one generation passed knowledge to the next. And something remarkable happened. As Noah's descendants spread across the earth, moving into different lands and climates and establishing their own civilizations, they carried the story with them. But something even more remarkable occurred. In places where Noah's descendants had never traveled, in civilizations that had no direct contact with the peoples who descended from Shem and Ham and Japheth, the story of the flood appeared. The Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations of the ancient world, had a story of a great flood. The hero of their account was a man named Ziusudra. The details were different from Noah's account. The names were different. The cultural context was different. But the essential elements were the same. A righteous man. A warning of coming judgment. The building of a vessel. The waters rising and covering the earth. The preservation of life within the vessel. The Babylonians, who rose to power centuries later in the same region, also preserved a flood narrative. They called their hero Atrahasis. Again, the details differed. The cultural elements were distinct, but the core story remained. A man chosen to be saved. A boat built to survive the deluge. Judgment falling on the earth because of humanity's wickedness. In ancient Egypt, though the flood narrative was less prominent, there were still echoes of it. References to times when the waters had covered the earth. Mythological accounts that suggested a knowledge of catastrophic inundation. In the Americas, among the civilizations that had developed independently from the Old World, without any possible contact with Noah's descendants, flood stories appeared. The Aztecs had accounts of a great deluge. The peoples of South America had similar narratives. The indigenous peoples of North America carried down stories of a time when the earth was covered with water and only a few were saved. In Asia, the ancient peoples of what would become India and China preserved flood narratives. The details varied. The cultural contexts were entirely different. The names were unrecognizable to anyone familiar with the account of Noah. But the fundamental story was there. Judgment, flood, preservation, covenant. How could this be? How could peoples separated by vast oceans and continents, with no possibility of communication, all preserve essentially the same story? The answer could only be one thing. They were all remembering the same historical event. The Great Flood was not a myth created independently by multiple cultures. It was a real event that had affected all of humanity. An event so catastrophic, so transformative, that its memory became encoded into the collective consciousness of the human race. The flood was a shared inheritance, a shared trauma, a shared reminder of God's judgment and mercy. As civilizations developed and writing systems emerged, the story began to be preserved in written form as well. The ancient Sumerians inscribed their version of the flood narrative on clay tablets. These tablets, some of which still exist today, buried beneath the sands of Iraq for thousands of years, are among the oldest written accounts of the flood that we possess. The Babylonians incorporated the flood narrative into their epic literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, contains an account of the flood. The hero of the epic, Gilgamesh, encounters a man named Utnapishtim who has survived a great deluge and been granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of how he was warned of the coming flood, built a boat, gathered animals, and rode out the deluge. The parallels to Noah's account are striking. In the Hebrew tradition, the story of Noah was preserved in the Book of Genesis. It was written down with meticulous detail. The genealogies that led to Noah, the account of his righteousness, the warning from God, the construction of the ark, the flood itself, the landing on Mount Ararat, the covenant and the rainbow. It was all recorded with precision and care, as if the author understood that this was a story that needed to be preserved exactly as it had been transmitted. And in that Hebrew text, we find something that connects all the other versions. We find the original source, the authentic account from which all others derived. Because the flood happened only once, but the memory of it spread across the entire world. Different cultures remembered it differently. They adapted it to their own mythologies and cultural contexts. But the core event was the same. The authenticity of Noah's account lies not just in its internal consistency, but in its presence in cultures that had no direct connection to each other. It is as if humanity, scattered across the earth, all carried with them a memory of the same traumatic event. And that memory, passed down through generations, eventually found its way into their stories and their writings. Centuries passed. Millennia. Civilizations rose to extraordinary heights of achievement. Egypt built pyramids that still stand today. Babylon became a center of learning and power. Greece developed philosophy and democracy. Rome built an empire that spanned continents. China created dynasties that lasted for centuries. And throughout all of this, the memory of the flood persisted. But something else happened as well. As time passed, as civilizations became more sophisticated and more removed from the events of the flood, the story began to change. It began to be interpreted differently. What had been literal history became mythologized. What had been a real judgment from a real God became symbolic. What had been a specific historical event became a metaphor for the cycles of nature or the struggles of civilization. Scholars began to debate the nature of the flood. Some argued that it was a local event, not a global catastrophe. They pointed out that the geological evidence suggested that there had been a massive flooding in ancient Mesopotamia, around the time that would correspond to Noah's era. Perhaps, they suggested, the local flood had been so devastating to the people who experienced it that they came to believe it had covered the entire earth. Others argued that it was merely a story, a myth, a narrative that various cultures had created independently to explain the cycles of nature or to express moral truths about judgment and redemption. They suggested that the commonality of flood stories across different cultures was not evidence of a shared historical event, but rather evidence of the universal human tendency to create similar stories when faced with similar challenges. But still others maintained that the flood had been exactly what the ancient texts described, a global catastrophe, a judgment from God that had covered the entire earth, an event so significant and so devastating that its memory had been preserved in the collective consciousness of humanity across all cultures and all continents. The truth is that all of these perspectives contain elements of what is real. There is geological evidence of a massive flood in Mesopotamia. There is also geological evidence of catastrophic flooding events at various points in human history. The cultural evidence of flood narratives across different civilizations is striking and difficult to explain through coincidence alone. And the theological significance of the flood, regardless of its precise historical nature, is undeniable. What matters most is this: the flood was remembered. It was preserved. It was considered important enough to be recorded by multiple ancient civilizations. It was considered significant enough to be included in sacred texts. And it was considered meaningful enough to be told and retold for thousands of years. Noah, the man who had built the ark, became a figure of legend. But he was more than a legend. He was a real person who had lived at a crucial moment in human history. A person who had heard the voice of God and obeyed. A person who had been faithful when the entire world had turned away. A person who had been chosen to be the father of a new humanity. His descendants spread across the earth. Some moved to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia and built the first great civilizations. Others moved to the Nile Valley and created the ancient Egyptian culture. Others went to the Indus Valley and established the early Indian civilizations. Others moved to the Yellow River region of China. And still others crossed the oceans, reaching the Americas and the islands of the Pacific. Everywhere they went, they carried with them the memory of the flood. They carried with them the knowledge that God could judge. They carried with them the hope that God could save. They carried with them the understanding that obedience was rewarded and disobedience was punished. They carried with them the knowledge of the covenant and the rainbow. And though the memory became distorted over time, though it became mythologized and adapted and incorporated into various religious and cultural traditions, though it became diluted and transformed as it passed from one generation to another, the core truth remained. There had been a flood. There had been judgment. There had been a man who was saved. There had been a preservation of life. There had been a covenant and a promise. The archaeological record began to provide evidence that corroborated the ancient texts. In the 1920s, an archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur in what is now Iraq. He discovered layers of sediment that suggested a massive flooding event. Above and below these layers were the remains of human habitation. But in the flood layer itself, there was no evidence of life, no pottery, no artifacts, just pure sediment deposited by water. This discovery suggested that there had indeed been a catastrophic flood that had interrupted human civilization in that region. The timing of this flood, based on the archaeological evidence and the historical records that could be dated, corresponded roughly with the time period that many scholars believed Noah to have lived. Other archaeological discoveries provided additional corroboration. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia began to be deciphered. The story of Ziusudra was found on clay tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered and translated. And in these texts, details appeared that matched the account in Genesis. A man chosen to be saved. A boat constructed to specific dimensions. Animals brought into the boat. A flood that covered the earth and destroyed civilization. The boat coming to rest on a mountain. Birds being sent out to determine if the waters had receded. The parallels were too specific to be dismissed as coincidence. Too detailed to be explained as independent mythological creation. The evidence pointed toward a shared source. A real event that had been remembered and preserved in multiple ways by different cultures. But the greatest legacy of the flood was not in its historical or archaeological verification. The greatest legacy was in what it meant spiritually. What it represented in the hearts and minds of people who had heard the story and been moved by it. The flood represented the reality that God judges evil. It represented the truth that consequences follow sin. It represented the knowledge that God's patience, though immeasurable, has limits. It represented the awareness that no person, no matter how powerful or great, can stand against the judgment of the Almighty. But the flood also represented mercy. It represented the fact that in the midst of judgment, there is always the possibility of salvation. That for those who hear the warning and respond in faith, there is a way to escape. That God does not judge without offering a path to redemption. That grace is always available to those who will reach for it. And most importantly, the flood represented the covenant. The promise that God would not abandon creation. That though judgment might come, it would not be the final word. That God's intention was not to destroy but ultimately to restore. That the rainbow would be a sign forever that judgment and mercy had found their balance in the heart of God. As centuries turned into millennia, as empires rose and fell, as the world changed and transformed beyond anything that the ancient peoples could have imagined, the story of the flood endured. It was preserved in sacred texts. It was retold in oral traditions. It was painted in art. It was carved in stone. It was kept alive in the human memory. And in every age, there were those who heard the story and understood its truth, who recognized that it was not just ancient history, that it was a message that spoke across time, that it addressed the fundamental questions that every human being must face, questions about judgment and mercy, questions about obedience and rebellion, questions about the nature of God and the nature of humanity. The flood became a turning point in human history, not just because of what it destroyed, but because of what it preserved. It preserved the knowledge of God. It preserved the understanding that there was a creator who cared about creation. It preserved the memory of what happens when humanity turns away from God and embraces corruption and violence. And it preserved the hope that even in the darkest times, even when the judgment seems complete and escape seems impossible, there is still the possibility of salvation. There is still the possibility of being preserved. There is still the possibility of stepping out of the ark onto a new world and beginning again. The legacy of Noah and the flood was written not just in ancient texts and archaeological evidence. It was written into the very fabric of human consciousness. It became part of the way that humans understood themselves and their relationship with the divine. It became a story that could not be forgotten because it was too important to forget. And in the modern world, thousands of years later, when archaeologists unearth ancient tablets and read the accounts of ancient peoples who remembered the flood, when scholars study the geological evidence of massive inundation events, when theologians and philosophers debate the meaning and significance of the deluge, when ordinary people read the account in the Bible or hear it told in church or encounter it in literature or film, they are all, in some way, participating in the legacy that began when Noah stepped out of the ark onto Mount Ararat. They are all remembering. They are all bearing witness to a truth that transcends time and culture and language. A truth about a God who judges but also saves. A God who can destroy but also renews. A God whose mercy is greater than his wrath. A God whose love is greater than his judgment. The flood was not the end of the story. It was a chapter, but it was a chapter written by God himself. And its echoes still resound through human history. But there are truths about the flood that are hidden. Truths that lie beneath the surface of the narrative. Truths that were not fully revealed in the account that was preserved and passed down through the generations. Truths that require us to look deeper, to think beyond what is written, to consider what was lost when the waters receded. The watchers who had descended to earth and corrupted creation were bound and imprisoned beneath the earth by the archangel Michael and the hosts of heaven. They were sealed in darkness, locked away in caverns of stone and shadow where no light could reach them, where they could neither see nor influence the world that they had defiled. They would remain there, awaiting the final judgment that God had decreed, unable to escape, unable to repent, unable to do anything but exist in the darkness of their own making. But what of their knowledge? The secrets that they had taught humanity, the forbidden arts, the forbidden sciences, the knowledge of how to manipulate the elements, how to alter the body, how to summon spirits, how to forge weapons of war, how to control the minds of men. All of this knowledge, taught to humanity before the flood, was not entirely erased when the waters receded. Some of it was preserved, not consciously, not in writing that could be easily found and read, but encoded into the collective memory of those who had learned it, passed down through the survivors, mixed with superstition and mythology, but containing kernels of truth, seeds of forbidden knowledge that would sprout again in later civilizations. This is why the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia possessed such advanced knowledge of astronomy. This is why they could predict celestial events with such accuracy. This is why their mathematical systems were so sophisticated. This is why they understood concepts that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. They had inherited fragments of the knowledge that the Watchers had taught. This is why ancient Egypt possessed engineering knowledge that allowed them to build structures of such precision that they still stand today. How did they know the exact dimensions needed? How did they understand the principles of weight distribution and architectural design? How did they possess knowledge that should have taken centuries of trial and error to develop? Because they had inherited it. They had received fragments of the advanced knowledge that had been taught before the flood. This is why the ancient texts of India and China contain descriptions of technologies and understanding that seem impossibly advanced for their time. Ancient Hindu texts describe flying vehicles. Ancient Chinese manuscripts describe advanced mechanical devices. Where did this knowledge come from? It came from the inheritance. It came from the Watchers' teachings, preserved and distorted through time but still recognizable to those who understood what to look for. But here is the deeper truth. The knowledge itself was not evil. The Watchers' teachings were not inherently corrupt. They became corrupt because they were used for the wrong purposes. They became destructive because they were wielded by those who had turned away from God. The knowledge of how to work with metals was used to forge weapons of war. The knowledge of how to work with the elements was used to dominate and control rather than to serve and protect. The knowledge of human nature was used to manipulate and enslave rather than to heal and elevate. This pattern would repeat throughout human history. Knowledge would be discovered or rediscovered, and that knowledge would be used by some for good and by others for evil. The same technology that could be used to heal could be used to harm. The same understanding of nature that could be used to create could be used to destroy. The same power that could be used to protect could be used to dominate. This is the hidden truth that the flood reveals about human nature. It is not knowledge itself that is the problem. It is the human heart. It is the tendency of those who gain power to use it for selfish purposes. It is the corruption that lives within the human soul that causes even the greatest gifts to be twisted into instruments of destruction. The flood did not destroy knowledge. It destroyed corruption. It washed away the Watchers and their direct influence. It eliminated the giants who ruled with tyranny. But it could not change the fundamental nature of humanity. It could not eliminate the tendency toward sin that exists in every human heart. This is why, even after the flood, even with the world cleansed and a new beginning offered, the corruption began to return. Within generations of Noah's descendants, people began to turn away from God again. They began to establish kingdoms. They began to build cities. They began to seek power and dominance. They began to create false gods and worship idols. The cycle was beginning again. And God, observing this from heaven, understood that the flood would not be the final solution. That there would need to be another way. That judgment alone could not save humanity. That something more was needed. Something deeper. Something that would address not just the external corruption but the internal corruption of the human heart. But there is another hidden truth. A truth about what lay beneath the waters when the flood receded. As the waters subsided and the earth was revealed, there were things buried beneath the mud and silt. Remnants of the pre-flood civilization. Artifacts of the Watchers' presence. Structures built by the giants. Knowledge preserved in forms that would take thousands of years to discover. Some of this has been found. Archaeologists have uncovered megalithic structures in various parts of the world that defy easy explanation. Stone monuments of such precision and such scale that they seem impossible given the tools and knowledge that the ancient people supposedly possessed. Stonehenge in Britain, Machu Picchu in Peru, the pyramids of Egypt, the temple complexes of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the Easter Island statues. These structures seem to carry within them a knowledge and a capability that should not have been possible. Were these built by the descendants of Noah using fragments of the knowledge that had been inherited from before the flood? Or were some of them built before the flood itself, by the giants and the watchers, preserved through catastrophic geological change, only to be discovered millennia later by peoples who had no understanding of how or why they were constructed? The truth is buried, literally buried beneath the earth, in places that have not yet been excavated, in regions that have not yet been fully explored, in depths that modern technology has not yet been able to reach. There are whispers in the ancient texts, references to places where knowledge was hidden, chambers beneath the earth where secrets were preserved, vaults that contained the accumulated learning of the pre-flood world. Some of these references appear in Sumerian and Babylonian texts, some appear in Egyptian hieroglyphics, some appear in ancient Hindu manuscripts, and some appear in the Bible itself. The Bible speaks of a time after the flood when people began to build a Tower of Babel, a structure so tall that it would reach into the heavens. Why would they build such a structure? What was the purpose? The conventional interpretation is that it was an act of human pride, an attempt to reach heaven, an attempt to make a name for themselves. But what if it was something else? What if it was an attempt to reach back into the knowledge of the past, to reconstruct what had been lost, to rebuild the connection between heaven and earth that had been severed? What if the Tower of Babel was not just an act of pride but an act of desperation, an attempt by the post-flood civilization to recover what the flood had taken from them? And when God confused their languages and scattered them, when the tower was left unfinished and abandoned, was he not just punishing pride but also preventing something? Preventing the reconstruction of the Watcher's influence, preventing the re-establishment of the forbidden connection between heaven and earth. There are also whispers about what happened to the bodies of the giants, the Nephilim who had ruled the earth before the flood. When the waters receded, where were their remains? Did they sink to the deepest parts of the ocean? Were they buried beneath layers of silt and rock? Are their bones still preserved somewhere, waiting to be discovered? The Bible speaks of giants existing even after the flood. Goliath, the giants of Gath, the Anakim. How could there be giants after the flood if all the Nephilim had been destroyed in the deluge? The conventional answer is that these later giants were the descendants of the original giants, that some Nephilim survived, that their lineage continued. But the Bible also speaks of these giants being unusually tall and powerful, of them possessing strength and abilities that seemed to exceed normal human capability. Where did these abilities come from? Were they genetic remnants of the Watcher's bloodline? Were they the result of corrupted knowledge being applied to human breeding and enhancement? And most troubling of all, are there still those who carry the blood of the Watchers? Are there still those alive today who are descended from the unions between the Watchers and human women? Are there still those who possess the knowledge and the bloodline and the ambition to recreate what was destroyed in the flood? This is a question that most people do not ask. Most people do not want to consider. But it is a question that is encoded into the ancient texts if one knows how to read them. It is a question that is suggested by certain patterns in human history, certain families, certain lineages, certain individuals who seem to possess knowledge and ability that exceeds what they should be able to possess. The truth is that we do not fully understand what the flood destroyed and what it preserved. We do not fully comprehend what knowledge was lost and what knowledge survived. We do not fully grasp what was hidden beneath the waters or what lies concealed in the earth waiting to be discovered. But there is one more hidden truth. A truth so profound that it is almost invisible in its obviousness. The flood happened. It was real. It was recorded by multiple ancient civilizations. It was preserved in sacred texts. It was remembered by peoples across the entire world. It changed the course of human history. It marked a dividing line between the world that was and the world that came after. And the fact that it happened means that it can happen again. Not necessarily in the same way. Not necessarily a flood of water that covers the entire earth. But judgment can come. God's patience, though immeasurable, has limits. The tolerance of the Almighty for human corruption and rebellion is not infinite. There are lines that, if crossed, will result in consequence. This is the message that the flood whispers across the centuries. This is the warning that is encoded into the narrative. This is the truth that echoes in every telling and every retelling of the account. God judges evil. God punishes corruption. God will not tolerate the violation of his creation forever. And those who think they can continue in sin without consequence are deceiving themselves. But there is also the other side of the truth about mercy, the truth about grace, the truth about salvation. God does not destroy without offering a way of escape. He does not judge without first warning. He does not punish those who turn back to him. He does not close the door of the ark on those who genuinely seek to enter. This is the other message of the flood. This is the other truth that it carries. That even in the darkest times, even when judgment is falling, even when the old world is being destroyed, there is still the possibility of being saved. There is still the possibility of stepping into the ark. There is still the possibility of surviving and inheriting a new world. The hidden truths of the flood are many. They are layered. They are deep. They require us to look beyond the surface narrative and consider the deeper implications. They require us to acknowledge that there is more to the story than what we have been told. That there are mysteries beneath the surface. That there are questions that have not yet been fully answered. But perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps the flood is meant to be mysterious. Perhaps it is meant to make us wonder. Perhaps it is meant to cause us to question. Perhaps it is meant to push us toward deeper understanding. Because the flood is not just a historical event. It is not just an ancient story. It is a message, a warning, a promise, a reminder of who God is and what He is capable of. A reminder of what human corruption looks like and what the consequences can be. A reminder of what grace looks like and how salvation is offered. And in a world that is increasingly distanced from the spiritual truths of the past. In a world where ancient texts are dismissed as mythology and divine warnings are ignored. In a world where knowledge is pursued without wisdom and power is sought without restraint. In a world where the lessons of the past are forgotten and the same mistakes are being made again. The flood stands as a testimony that God exists, a testimony that God sees, a testimony that God judges, a testimony that God saves, a testimony that the choices we make have consequences, a testimony that there is still time to turn back, a testimony that there is still a way of escape. The waters have receded, the ark has landed, the covenant has been made, but the message remains, the warning persists, the opportunity for salvation continues, and somewhere beneath the earth, somewhere in the depths of the ocean, somewhere in the rocks and the mud and the layers of geological history, there are remnants of the old world, remnants that are slowly being discovered, remnants that are beginning to tell their own story, remnants that suggest that the flood was far more than what we have been told, far more real, far more significant, far more meaningful. The question that faces each generation is this: will we listen to the message of the flood? Will we heed the warning? Will we understand the grace that is being offered? Or will we, like those who mocked Noah, turn away and ignore the voice calling us toward salvation? The flood happened once, but the choice faces us anew in every moment. The story of the flood is not ancient history. It is not a relic of the past that has no relevance to the world we live in today. It is a message, a warning, a mirror held up to our own time. And if we are willing to look into that mirror, we will see ourselves reflected back, because the patterns that led to the flood are repeating. The same corruption that infected the pre-flood world is rising again in our world. The same rebellion against God that characterized that ancient civilization is becoming increasingly visible in our own. The same pursuit of knowledge without wisdom. The same accumulation of power without restraint. The same violation of natural boundaries. The same worship of false gods and false ideals. All of it is happening again. Look at the world we live in. Look at what has been built in the past century. Towers that reach into the clouds. Technologies that allow us to manipulate the very fabric of creation. Knowledge of the human genome. Artificial intelligence that begins to think for itself. Weapons of such destructive power that they could end civilization in hours. Medical procedures that allow us to alter our own bodies. Virtual realities that allow us to escape from physical reality. All of this knowledge. All of this capability. And what are we doing with it? We are using it to dominate, to control, to accumulate wealth and power for ourselves while others suffer in poverty and despair. We are using it to destroy the natural world that God created. We are using it to create weapons that can annihilate entire cities. We are using it to manipulate the minds of people through media and technology and psychological manipulation. We are doing exactly what the Watchers taught humanity to do. We are pursuing knowledge without wisdom. We are wielding power without restraint. We are violating boundaries that should not be violated. We are creating things that should not be created. And perhaps most troubling of all, we are doing this while convincing ourselves that we are enlightened, that we are evolved, that we have moved beyond the primitive superstitions of the past, that we are creating a better world, that we are improving humanity, but we are not. We are repeating the patterns that led to the flood. We are walking the same path that led to judgment. Consider the issue of genetic manipulation. Scientists are now able to edit the human genome. They can remove genetic diseases. They can enhance certain traits. They can create designer babies. They can, theoretically, create new forms of life that have never existed before. This is knowledge that the Watchers possessed. This is the kind of power that they wielded. This is the violation of natural boundaries that led to the creation of the Nephilim, those twisted beings that belong to no natural category. Are we not doing the same thing? Are we not crossing lines that should not be crossed? Are we not creating things that should not be created? Consider the issue of artificial intelligence. We are creating machines that can think, that can learn, that can make decisions, that can improve themselves. We are creating something that approaches consciousness. We are creating something that rivals human intelligence and eventually surpasses it. We are creating something that we may not be able to control. This is knowledge that the Watchers had. This is power that they possessed. This is the kind of hubris that led to their downfall. Are we not repeating their mistake? Consider the accumulation of power. A small number of individuals control vast amounts of wealth. A small number of corporations control the information that the world receives. A small number of governments control the fate of billions. Power is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And those who hold that power are increasingly using it to control those who do not, to manipulate them, to bend them to their will. This is exactly what the giants did. This is exactly what the Watchers' system of control looked like. Consider the worship of false gods. We live in a world where money is worshipped, where celebrity is worshipped, where technology is worshipped, where the self is worshipped. We have created a culture in which material success is the highest good, in which accumulation of possessions is the path to happiness, in which the appearance of having it all is more important than the reality of being content. We have replaced the worship of the true God with the worship of everything else. This is not a new phenomenon. This is exactly what happened before the flood. People turned away from the true God and began to worship idols of their own making. They placed their faith in false gods. They built altars to demons. They sacrificed their children to acquire power and wealth. And we are doing the same thing. Consider the violation of natural boundaries. Humanity is changing the climate of the earth through the burning of fossil fuels and the release of greenhouse gases. We are polluting the oceans and the air. We are destroying forests at an unprecedented rate. We are driving species to extinction. We are fundamentally altering the ecosystems that support life. We are treating the earth that God created as if it belongs to us alone, as if we have the right to do with it whatever we wish. But the earth does not belong to us. We are stewards. We are guardians. We are responsible for caring for creation, not destroying it. And in our arrogance and greed, we are violating that responsibility. We are violating the boundaries of what creation can tolerate. Consider the prevalence of violence. Despite all of our advances in technology and civilization, violence remains endemic to human society. Wars continue to rage across the world. Genocides continue to happen. Children continue to be abused. Women continue to be violated. The weak continue to be preyed upon by the strong. And we seem incapable of stopping it. We seem incapable of creating a world in which peace and justice reign. This is the legacy of the Watchers. This is what their knowledge produced. Violence as an art form. Destruction as a science. The strong dominating the weak. The powerful consuming the powerless. And we have inherited that legacy. We have taken their knowledge and made it our own. We have become like them. But here is the truth that we must understand. We are not inevitable victims of this cycle. We are not doomed to repeat the patterns of the past. We still have a choice. We still have time to turn back. The flood is a warning. It is a message from God that says, this is what happens when humanity turns completely away from me. This is what happens when corruption becomes so total, so complete, that there is no longer any good left in the world. This is the consequence of rebellion. But it is not just a warning about judgment. It is also a reminder about mercy. It is a reminder that even when the judgment is falling, even when it seems like all hope is lost, there is still the possibility of salvation. There is still the ark. There is still a way to escape. Noah was chosen not because he was perfect. The Bible makes clear that Noah was a sinner like everyone else. He had flaws. He made mistakes. But he was righteous. He walked with God. He obeyed when everyone else mocked. He held on to faith when faith seemed foolish. And because of that, because of his choice to remain faithful in an unfaithful world, because of his willingness to obey even when obedience made no sense, because of his commitment to truth even when truth was being rejected, he was saved. His family was saved. His descendants were saved. And the world was given another chance. This is the message that the flood carries for us today. This is the warning and the promise combined. Yes, judgment is coming. Yes, consequences will follow for those who continue in corruption and rebellion. Yes, there are limits to God's patience. But there is also grace. There is also the possibility of being saved. There is also the ark. For each of us, in our own lives, we face a choice. We face the question that Noah faced. Will we listen to the voice calling us toward righteousness? Will we choose obedience even when it is unpopular? Will we stand for truth even when truth is being rejected? Will we walk with God even when the world is walking away from Him? Or will we, like those who mocked Noah, turn away and ignore the warning? The choice is not about the external circumstances of our lives. It is not about whether we are rich or poor, powerful or powerless, successful or unsuccessful in the eyes of the world. The choice is about the orientation of our hearts. The choice is about whether we place our faith in God or in ourselves. Whether we place our hope in the world or in the eternal. Whether we pursue righteousness or corruption. And the flood stands as an eternal reminder that this choice matters. That it has consequences. That the way we live in response to this choice will determine our ultimate fate. In the world today, there are those who are building arks of their own. Not literal arks, but arks nonetheless. They are creating sanctuaries of faith and righteousness in a world that is increasingly hostile to both. They are choosing to live differently, to think differently, to value different things. They are walking with God in a world that is walking away from Him. These people are not always visible. They do not always make headlines. They do not always accumulate wealth or power or fame. But they are there. And they are the ones who are being preserved. They are the ones who will survive the judgment that is coming. Because judgment is coming. Not necessarily in the form of a flood of water, but in some form. The consequences of our corruption are already becoming visible. The world is becoming increasingly unstable. The climate is changing. Ecosystems are collapsing. Societies are fragmenting. Wars are multiplying. Famines are spreading. The signs are appearing. The warnings are being given. And as they were in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. These are the words recorded in the Gospel. They suggest that as the judgment came in Noah's day, so judgment will come again. Perhaps not in the same form, but in some form. Some kind of judgment. Some kind of reckoning. Some kind of moment when God will say enough. And those who have not prepared, those who have not chosen to walk with God, those who have ignored the warning and mocked the messenger, those who have continued in their rebellion and corruption, they will find themselves in the same position as those who stood outside the ark watching the waters rise. But for those who have prepared, for those who have chosen faith over doubt, for those who have chosen obedience over rebellion, for those who have walked with God in a world that walks away from Him, there will be preservation, there will be salvation, there will be the possibility of inheriting a new world. The final warning of the flood is this: the time for preparation is now. The time for making the choice is now. The time for turning back to God is now. Because we do not know when the door of the ark will close. We do not know when the judgment will fall. We do not know how much time remains. All we know is that time is passing. All we know is that the patterns of corruption are accelerating. All we know is that the world is moving in a direction that is increasingly away from God and toward chaos. All we know is that judgment, when it comes, will come suddenly, like a thief in the night. And those who are not prepared will be caught unawares. Those who have put their faith in the wrong things will see that faith shattered. Those who have built their lives on the foundations of sand will watch those foundations crumble. But those who have prepared, those who have chosen to walk with God, those who have built their lives on the eternal rock, those will endure. The ark is still there. It is not a physical structure made of wood and pitch. It is a spiritual reality. It is the protection of God offered to those who turn to Him. It is the grace that saves those who believe. It is the covenant that is offered to all who will accept it. And the door is still open. But how much longer it will remain open, we do not know. The flood happened once, but its message echoes across the millennia. It speaks to every generation. It speaks to us, in this moment, in this age, in this time when the corruption is rising again and the patterns of the past are being repeated. And it asks us the same question that it asked those who lived in Noah's day. Will we listen? Will we heed the warning? Will we turn back? Will we choose the ark while the door is still open? Or will we, like those who mocked Noah, continue on our path toward judgment? The choice is ours. The time is now. And the stakes could not be higher. But there is something more, something deeper, something that transforms the story of the flood from a mere historical account into something far greater. Something that changes everything we thought we understood about judgment and mercy, about God's plan for humanity, about the ultimate destiny of creation itself. The flood was not the end of the story. It was not God's final word. It was not the ultimate solution to the problem of human sin and corruption. It was a chapter, a crucial chapter. A chapter that revealed truth and set the stage for what was to come. But it was not the final chapter. Because God had a plan that was far greater than the flood. A plan that had been established before the foundation of the world was laid. A plan that encompassed not just judgment but redemption. Not just destruction but restoration. Not just the removal of corruption but the transformation of the human heart itself. This plan had been hidden in shadow and mystery from the beginning of time. It had been whispered about in the prophecies of the ancients. It had been hinted at in the symbols and the types that were woven throughout human history, but it had not been fully revealed. Not yet. The flood was a sign pointing toward something greater. The ark was a symbol of salvation that would be offered in a form that was far more profound and far more personal than a wooden vessel floating on the waters of judgment. Consider the dimensions of the ark. 3 stories, multiple compartments, space for the animals, space for the family, space for food and supplies. It was designed to preserve life through the judgment, to protect the righteous while the unrighteous perished outside. Now consider this. In the ultimate plan of God, there would come a time when judgment would fall again. Not a flood of water, but a judgment far more severe. A judgment that would separate the righteous from the unrighteous not just physically but eternally. a judgment in which the very fate of the soul would be at stake. And in response to that judgment, God would offer something greater than an ark of wood. He would offer an ark made of flesh and blood, an ark in the form of a human being, a person who would carry within himself the power to save those who believed, a person who would stand between the judgment of God and the condemned, offering protection to those who would trust in him. This person would be born of a virgin. He would live a sinless life in a world of sinners. He would preach a message of repentance and redemption. He would be rejected and mocked and condemned by those in power. And ultimately, he would lay down his life as a sacrifice for the sins of all humanity. His name would be Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. This is the ultimate revelation that the flood contains. This is the deeper meaning that lies beneath the surface narrative. The flood was not just a historical judgment. It was a foreshadowing, a preview, a picture in advance of something far greater that God would do. Just as God offered Noah and his family salvation through the ark while judgment fell on the world outside, so God would offer all of humanity salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Just as those who entered the ark were preserved while those who rejected the ark perished, so those who believe in Christ are preserved while those who reject him face judgment. The parallels are striking. They are too specific to be coincidence. They are too detailed to be accidental. They reveal a pattern, a divine pattern, a pattern of redemption that runs through all of human history. Noah heard the voice of God and obeyed. Jesus heard the voice of God and obeyed. Noah was faithful when the world was unfaithful. Jesus remained faithful when the world rejected him. Noah built an ark to save those who would believe. Jesus became the ark, the ultimate salvation, for all who would believe. The Old Covenant, the covenant that God made with Noah after the flood, was sealed with a rainbow, a sign in the sky, a reminder that judgment was tempered with mercy, that though God judges evil, his love endures forever. The new covenant, the covenant that God would make through Jesus Christ, would be sealed not with a sign in the sky but with blood, the blood of the Son of God, a sign written into the very substance of sacrifice, a reminder that judgment is real and serious, but that grace is greater than judgment, that mercy triumphs over wrath. And just as the waters of the flood washed away the old world, so the waters of baptism would wash away the sins of those who believe. Just as Noah emerged from the ark into a new world, so those who are baptized in the name of Christ emerge into a new life, born again, transformed, given a second chance. The connection is not accidental. It is intentional. It is part of God's design. God is not contradicting himself or changing his method. He is revealing a pattern that has always been present. A pattern of judgment and mercy. A pattern of destruction and restoration. A pattern of death and resurrection. This is the ultimate revelation. This is what the flood is really about. But there is more. There is an even deeper truth that lies beneath this one. The flood reveals something about the nature of God that we often overlook. It reveals that God is serious about evil. That God does not tolerate corruption indefinitely. That God's patience, though vast, is not infinite. That there are consequences for sin. Real consequences. Severe consequences. In a world that has become comfortable with the idea that all is forgiven, that judgment is a myth of the past, that God is only love and never wrath, the flood stands as a testimony that contradicts this false comfort. The flood says that judgment is real, that sin has consequences, that rebellion against God will be punished. But at the same time, the flood also reveals something else about the nature of God. It reveals that even in judgment, there is mercy. Even in wrath, there is grace. Even in destruction, there is the possibility of salvation. God did not want to flood the earth. He did not want to destroy humanity. He offered warnings. He sent a preacher of righteousness. He gave people time to repent. He provided a way of escape for those who would believe. This is the character of God revealed in the flood. A God who is both just and merciful. A God who judges evil but offers grace to those who turn from evil. A God who is serious about sin but generous in his offer of forgiveness. And this character of God, revealed in the flood, reaches its ultimate expression in the cross. At the cross, the justice of God and the mercy of God meet. The judgment that humanity deserves is poured out. The wrath that sin has incurred is satisfied. But at the same time, that judgment and wrath falls upon Jesus himself. The innocent one bears the guilt of the guilty. The righteous one suffers the punishment of the unrighteous. The Son of God dies so that sinners might live. This is grace. This is mercy. This is love in its most extreme and radical form. This is God demonstrating that his desire is not to condemn but to save. That his intention is not to destroy but to redeem. That his ultimate will is not judgment but restoration. The flood prepared humanity for this message. It showed us the reality of judgment. It showed us that God takes sin seriously. It showed us that there is a point at which God says enough. But it also showed us that God does not desire to judge, that he offers a way out, that there is always the possibility of being saved if we will only believe and obey. And when Jesus came, he came with this same message. Repent, he said. Turn away from your sin. Believe in me. Accept the salvation that I am offering, because judgment is coming. But for those who believe, there is no condemnation. There is only life. This is the connection. This is the pattern. This is the revelation that ties it all together. But there is one more truth, the most important truth, the truth that transforms everything. The flood was not the end of human history, but it was not the beginning of redemption either. The redemption that would come through Christ had been planned from before the foundation of the world. It had been written into the very fabric of creation. It had been foreshadowed in the symbols and the types that fill the Old Testament. And the flood was one of those foreshadows, one of those symbols, one of those types that pointed forward to the ultimate salvation that God would provide. But more than that, the flood was also a fulfillment of the judgment that sin deserves, a judgment that was real and complete, a judgment that demonstrated what the absence of God's grace looks like, a judgment that showed what happens when mercy is finally withdrawn. And in showing this judgment, the flood also showed the alternative. It showed what grace looks like. It showed what salvation looks like. It showed what it means to be preserved when all around you is destruction, to be protected when all around you is danger, to be saved when all around you is death. This is the message of the flood for those who have ears to hear it. This is the revelation that lies at the heart of the narrative. We live in a time when judgment is coming, not a flood of water, but a judgment nonetheless, a final judgment, a judgment in which every person who has ever lived will stand before God and give an account of their life, a judgment in which the righteous will be separated from the unrighteous, a judgment in which eternity will be assigned. And in the face of this coming judgment, the same choice that faced those in Noah's day now faces us. Will we enter the ark? Will we accept the salvation that is being offered? Will we turn from our sin and place our faith in Jesus Christ? Or will we, like those who mocked Noah, turn away and ignore the warning? The ark is still available. The door is still open. Grace is still being offered. Salvation is still within reach. But we do not know how much longer this will be true. We do not know when the door will close. We do not know when the opportunity for salvation will pass away forever. All we know is that the time is now. The moment is this one. The choice is before us. Noah preached to his generation. He warned them of coming judgment. He called them to repentance. And they mocked him. They rejected his message. They continued in their sin. And when the judgment came, they were outside the ark. They were caught unprepared. They were destroyed. But there were 8 who believed. 8 who entered the ark. 8 who were preserved. 8 who inherited a new world. How many will believe in our generation? How many will accept the salvation that is being offered through Christ? How many will enter the ark and be preserved from the judgment that is coming? This is the question that the flood asks of us. This is the revelation that it contains. This is the ultimate message. And the answer to this question will determine not just our eternal fate, but the fate of the world itself. Because those who believe, those who are preserved, those who are saved through faith in Christ, become the seeds of a new world, the heirs of God's kingdom, the inheritors of eternity. Just as Noah and his family stepped out of the ark onto Mount Ararat and became the foundation of a new civilization, so those who are saved through Christ will step out into eternity and become the foundation of a new creation. A creation without sin, without pain, without suffering, without death. A creation in which God will dwell with his people and they will dwell with him forever. This is the ultimate promise. This is the ultimate hope. This is what the flood points toward. This is what all of human history is moving toward. A moment when God will say it is finished. When the old creation will pass away. When the new creation will begin. When those who have been preserved through faith will inherit everything that God has prepared for them. The flood was a judgment, but it was also a mercy. It was a destruction, but it was also a preservation. It was an ending, but it was also a beginning. And in the same way, the cross was a death, but it was also a resurrection. It was a defeat, but it was also a victory. It was an ending, but it was also a beginning. Everything points to this. Everything in Scripture, everything in history, everything in the natural world, everything in our own hearts, points to the reality of God's plan. The plan of redemption. The plan of restoration. The plan of ultimate salvation for all who believe. The flood reveals this plan. The flood contains this message. The flood carries this revelation. And if we have eyes to see it and ears to hear it, we will understand not just the story of Noah, but the story of Jesus. Not just the history of judgment, but the hope of salvation. Not just the destruction of the old world, but the promise of the new world to come. This is the ultimate revelation. This is the deepest truth. This is what the flood really means. This is why it matters. This is why it was preserved. This is why it has been told and retold for thousands of years. Because it is not just a story about the past. It is a message for the future. It is a warning and a promise combined. It is a call to decision. A call to choose. A call to enter the ark while there is still time. And that call echoes across the centuries. It echoes in the ancient texts. It echoes in the hearts of those who believe. It echoes in the world that is still waiting for judgment. It echoes in the lives of those who have been saved and those who have not yet been saved. The question is, will you hear it? Will you respond to it? Will you enter the ark? Because the waters are rising again, not of water, but of time, of consequence, of judgment approaching. The sky is darkening, the storm is gathering, the moment of decision is at hand. And soon, perhaps sooner than anyone expects, the door will close, the ark will depart, and those who are left behind will understand, too late, what they have lost, what they have rejected, what they have refused to accept. But for those who believe, for those who have entered the ark, for those who have placed their faith in Jesus Christ and the salvation that He offers, there is hope, there is peace, there is the knowledge that no matter what comes, no matter what happens, they will be preserved, they will be saved, they will inherit the new world that God is preparing. This is the ultimate revelation of the flood. This is the message that transforms everything. This is the truth that changes lives, and it begins now, in this moment, with this choice. The ark has landed, the waters have receded, the covenant has been made, the rainbow stands in the sky as a sign of God's mercy. Noah and his family step out onto a world that has been cleansed, a world that has been given another chance. But the story does not end there, because we are still living in that world. We are still the descendants of those who were saved. We are still inheriting the consequences of the choices that were made in those ancient days. We are still facing the same decision that Noah faced, the same decision that those who lived before the flood faced. Will we believe? Will we obey? Will we enter the ark while there is still time? Or will we turn away and ignore the warning? The flood happened. It was real. The evidence is all around us if we know where to look. In the geological layers of the earth, in the ancient texts of civilizations that had no contact with each other, in the stories that have been passed down through thousands of years of human history, in the memories that are encoded into the very consciousness of humanity itself. But more than that, the flood carries a message that is as relevant today as it was 4,700 years ago. A message about the consequences of sin, a message about the reality of judgment, a message about the availability of grace. The world that we live in today bears the marks of the pre-flood civilization. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, we have the power, but we have lost the wisdom to use these things righteously. We have become corrupted by the same forces that corrupted the ancient world. We worship false gods. We accumulate power for ourselves. We violate the boundaries of nature. We prey on the weak. We build towers that reach toward heaven with our own hands. And judgment is coming. Not because God is cruel. Not because God enjoys punishing His creation. But because God is just. Because God takes sin seriously. Because God will not tolerate the violation and corruption of His creation forever. But judgment is not the final word. Mercy is. Grace is. Salvation is. Because even now, in this moment, the ark is still available. Even now, salvation is still being offered. Even now, the door is still open. Those who turn from their sin and place their faith in Jesus Christ will be saved. They will be preserved through the judgment. They will inherit the new world that God is preparing. But we do not know how much longer this will be true. The signs are all around us. The world is becoming increasingly unstable. The moral foundations are crumbling. The natural world is responding to our corruption with instability and chaos. Wars are multiplying. Famines are spreading. Diseases are emerging. The creation itself is groaning under the weight of what we have done to it. These are the signs. These are the warnings. These are the calls to wake up and pay attention to what is happening. And yet, most people ignore them. Most people continue on as if nothing has changed. Most people continue to pursue the same paths that lead to destruction. Most people continue to mock those who warn them. Most people continue to reject the message of salvation. They are making the same choice that those made before the flood. They are repeating the same mistakes. They are walking the same path toward judgment. But you do not have to. You still have a choice. You still have time. The door of the ark is still open. The invitation to salvation is still being extended. The question is, what will you do? Will you ignore the warning and continue on your current path? Will you scoff at the message and turn away? Will you tell yourself that judgment is not real and that you do not need to change? Will you live as if you have unlimited time and unlimited second chances? Or will you wake up? Will you listen to the warning? Will you turn from your sin and place your faith in Jesus Christ? Will you accept the salvation that is being offered to you? This is not a decision that can be made lightly. This is not a choice that can be put off to some future moment. This is the most important decision that you will ever make, because it will determine not just your temporal fate, but your eternal fate. It will determine whether you are preserved or destroyed, whether you inherit life or death, whether you will spend eternity with God or separated from Him. And the time to make this decision is now. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not next year. Now. In this moment. While you still have the chance. While the door is still open. Because we do not know what tomorrow will bring. We do not know if we will have another opportunity. We do not know when the call will end and the judgment will begin. All we know is that time is passing. All we know is that the world is moving towards something. Something that will change everything. Something that will separate the saved from the unsaved. Something that will usher in eternity. Noah preached for 120 years. For 120 years, he warned the people to repent and enter the ark. For 120 years, they mocked him and rejected his message. And then the rains came. And the door closed. And judgment fell. And those who had rejected the warning discovered too late that it was real. That the flood was not a myth or a metaphor but a physical reality. That they had made a terrible mistake in ignoring Noah's preaching. But by then it was too late. The ark was gone. The door was sealed. There was no escape. Do not make their mistake. Do not wait until it is too late. Do not ignore the warning that is being given to you. The signs are all around. The message is clear. The invitation is open. The door is still unlocked. Enter the ark. Accept the salvation. Place your faith in Jesus Christ. Turn from your sin and embrace righteousness. Believe in the one who died for you and rose again. Trust in the God who judges evil but also saves those who believe. Do it now. Do it today. Do not wait for another moment. Do not put it off until tomorrow. Because tomorrow may never come. The next moment may never arrive. The door may close, and you will be left standing outside, realizing too late what you have lost. The flood happened. The evidence is real. The message is clear. The decision is yours. But know this, whatever choice you make, it will have consequences. Eternal consequences. Consequences that will echo throughout eternity. If you choose to ignore the warning and continue in your rebellion against God, you will face the judgment. You will stand before God and give an account of your life. And judgment will be rendered. And you will face the consequences of your choice forever. But if you choose to enter the ark, if you choose to believe, if you choose to turn from your sin and place your faith in Jesus Christ, then you will be saved. You will be preserved. You will inherit eternal life. You will spend eternity in the presence of God, in a world without pain or suffering or death. In a world of perfect peace and perfect joy and perfect love. The choice is yours. The door is open. The time is now. But soon, perhaps sooner than anyone expects, the moment will pass. The opportunity will close. The door will shut. And those who have not entered will find themselves on the outside, watching the waters rise, realizing too late that they should have believed, that they should have obeyed, that they should have entered the ark when there was still time. Do not let that be you. Enter the ark. Accept the salvation. Believe in Jesus Christ. Place your faith in the one who died for you and rose again. Turn from your sin and embrace righteousness. Do it now. Do it today. Do not wait, because time is running out. The storm is gathering. The waters are rising. And soon, judgment will fall. But for those who are in the ark, for those who have believed, for those who have placed their faith in Jesus Christ, there is safety, there is peace. There is the knowledge that no matter what happens, no matter how terrible the judgment becomes, they will be preserved. They will be saved. They will inherit the new world that God is preparing. This is the message of the flood. This is the warning. This is the promise. This is the call that echoes across the centuries and into your heart, right now, in this moment. The question is, will you answer? The ark is waiting. The door is open. Salvation is being offered. What will you do?